Hello and welcome to ELPC Thinks. I'm Howard Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. We bring together political leaders, experts, environmental leaders, and community partners to forge new strategies for progress. And a quick heads up, we're recording this live on Facebook so that people who aren't able to join right now can listen in later to Senator Duckworth's comments. And I am honored to be joined today by our good friend, the terrific U.S. Senator, Senator Tammy Duckworth. Senator Duckworth has been a strong, lifelong leader for clean air, clean water, and public health. Senator Duckworth serves on the Environmental and Public Works Committee of the Senate and chairs the vitally important subcommittee on fisheries, water, and wildlife. As if that weren't enough, Senator, you serve on the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, the Special Committee on the Climate Crisis, and you're a co-founding co-chair of the Environmental Justice Caucus, which is great. And today we'll discuss Senator Duckworth's vision and environmental priorities. We'll try to save a little bit of time for questions, so use the Q&A box. Thank you, Senator, for joining us today. I know how extraordinarily busy you are in Congress, and there's so many issues to cover, from clean water to climate change, to the Great Lakes, to clean transportation. And let's start with clean water. And first, a big victory. Congratulations on the passage of your Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act that was part of the overall infrastructure legislation. I know you worked especially hard on it. Your staff did a terrific job. We were pleased to help out in modest ways. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to sponsor and advocate so strongly for this legislation? And why is it so important?
Well, thank you, Howard. It's good to be here. It's funny, if you talked to me back in 2012 when I first ran for the House of Representatives and told me then when I was really talking about a lot of veterans causes and armed services, which are still very close to my heart, if you said, Tammy, you're going to in 6 years become very excited about sewer systems, I would have said, you're crazy. But I am very excited. And it really started when I was in my first term in the House when Flint, Michigan happened. And I was in my in the hearing room, and I just had my baby, my Abigail, and she was 6 months old, and there was a mom there who'd had a baby about the same time, and she was holding up a baby bottle just like the one my daughter used, but the water in it was brown. And I realized how devastating would have been to, after giving birth to my daughter, realize that during the whole period of my pregnancy, I was drinking water contaminated with lead without knowing it, and that is still the only water I had to give to my child. And that really began my work on drinking water and wastewater. I would say, most important of all to me with the Drinking Water and Wastewater, or DWIA Act that we passed, is the investment of more than $35 billion in water infrastructure projects. And this is the largest single investment in our wastewater and drinking water system in the history of our nation. And I'm really, really proud of that.
Take it down a little bit, if you would, to the practical level, because this is terrific legislation and you should be proud. It's funny for us to say it, but really you should be proud, and we're honored to work with you on it. How will the increased federal funding make a difference when it comes to access to clean water for people in all types of communities, whether it's in Illinois, urban, rural, or suburban? How does it matter? What difference does it make?
Well, it matters because your zip code, it shouldn't matter what your zip code is or how much money you make or how big a town or city that you live in. Clean drinking water is a human right. It's a basic need for you to survive. And frankly, we've not had that in this country. We talk about how great, you should be able to drink water out of the tap and it's got fluoride in it and all that. But from a lot of people, and in Illinois, where we have the largest concentration of lead service pipes in the entire nation, we have 23% of the total lead service pipes in the entire country is in Illinois. That's really been, that access to clean drinking water has been something that a lot of communities can't afford. What the bill does, Howard, is that it makes the funding for infrastructure projects to get the lead out of our water systems and to fix our broken sewer systems accessible for communities that have a small tax base, right? If you're a large city or if you are a wealthy suburb, you've been able to fix your water supply. And the federal cost share means that, if you have a $10 million project, the federal cost share is 8 and your local cost share is 2. But if you have no tax base, $2 million is beyond reach. $200,000 is beyond reach for many of our smaller communities and our impoverished communities. And so what this bill does that I'm very, very proud of is that it sets aside 40% of funding for these communities that will be given to them in terms of grants and debt forgiveness so that they don't have to try to come up on their own with the $2 billion to get that $10 million project done. And then that means that finally the fixes to the broken infrastructure system in this country will be accessible to all communities, whether you are a rural community that's still on well water, or you are an urban community that really struggles to raise the funds. So everybody will have access now.
And the way you've described it is so completely right. Access to safe, clean drinking water is a basic human right. It's a basic civil right. You also mentioned lead. Let's turn to lead service pipes, because as you pointed out, Chicago and Illinois have the most old lead service pipes of anywhere in the country. You were a leader in achieving, I think it's $15 billion for a national effort to remove all lead service lines. And bravo. I know how hard it was to get that done. With the Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee, you'll be holding a hearing in Chicago on April 21st to discuss how states can move forward with this lead service line replacement funding. It's the right place for the hearing, given how much of the problem is in Chicago. Can you talk a little bit more about this legislation, how it's going to accelerate replacing lead service pipes? What are the next steps? Why does it matter so much to you?
What matters so much to me because there's no safe level of lead in drinking water. Any level of lead, especially for children, causes brain damage and causes harm to their development. And so there is no level of lead that is safe. So that's why we have to get rid of it. We don't want to be giving our children poison to drink, because that's what lead is. It is poison to the human body. And yet millions of pipes across the country are delivering water to homes, and those pipes contain lead. And that has directly resulted in a national health crisis because we have these old service lines that are made from lead. In some cases, we have applied a coating to the inside of the service lines that prevents the lead from seeping into the water that's being carried in those pipes. This is what was happening in Flint, Michigan. They had these old lead service lines. It had this protective coating on it, but when Flint changed the source of their water from what they were getting and they started using Flint River water, that river water actually was more acidic and it leached away that protective coating, which then allowed the lead to get into the water. So any one of us could be getting water from a service line that simply has this protective coating on it. And that protective coating could be washed, could be leached away at any time. So we have to replace it all. This is a national health crisis. We will be, if you were just callous and didn't care about human being and didn't have emotions and you were just looking at the dollars and cents, it makes more sense to fix the lead service line now than to pay for the healthcare costs for the entire lifespan of an individual who's going to be poisoned as a child drinking lead. So it costs taxpayers less money to fix this problem up front than it is to deal with the health consequences for the nation of lead poisoning across the country. So the only real solution, Howard, is to replace all the lead service lines. And in the DeWia bill, there was an over $700 million in additional lead reduction grant programs to help with things like lead in schools and childcare facilities on top of the $15 billion for each state's lead service line removal process. So we're going to get at this. We're going to get at this in people's homes. We're going to get at this in municipal buildings. We're going to get at this in schools anywhere there's a drinking fountain, we're going to make sure that it's not delivering lead contaminated water.
You know, one of the things I've always thought that's extraordinary about this, more than 50 years ago as a nation, we phased out leaded gas. All new cars were fitted with catalytic converters, and you can't buy lead gas anymore at a gas station. You haven't been able to do that for decades. We recognize as a nation that lead is a poison. It harms people's health, and we got it out of gasoline, and that worked. Today, when you go to a gas station, everything you buy is unleaded gas. And at the same time, it's taken us this long to deal with lead service pipes that instead of it being lead going into your car tank and then into the air, the lead is going directly into the tap that you're drinking from. So I think it's high time that as a country, we're phasing out lead service pipes. And what you're doing is it's belated that you have to do it now, and so important that you're getting it done now so that we can avoid lead going directly into the water we drink coming out of taps in too many homes in Chicago and around the country. So congratulations. And is there anything that community groups, public officials, locally, others can or should be doing when it comes to lead service pipes now that you've gotten this legislation passed? What do you expect to hear at the April 21st hearings in Chicago?
Well, Howard, I think what I am expecting to hear is getting community participation in the program. At this point, our states and municipal governments will have the money to replace the lead service lines, but they need the homeowner's permission to come in and do that work. So they can replace all of the stuff that's on public property, but to go from the street into your house, that requires the homeowner's permission. And if you're especially in a high rental community, say you're in a lower income community where you have these landlords that are large corporations or somebody who owns several homes, it's really hard to get a hold of those landlords to say, hey, give us permission so that we can go in and do this. And I had there's a really interesting hearing yesterday that I held with testimony from Mayor Ras Baraka, the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, who they were able to replace all 23,000 lead service lines in the city in less than 3 years. And he said what the critical thing was he said he only had 3% participation of rental properties when it was voluntary and people had to opt into the program, even though it was completely free, because he just couldn't track down all of those landlords. Right. And he couldn't track down all the homeowners. But when they passed legislation to make it mandatory but free, so he could just go in and do it, and it didn't cost a homeowner anything, that was where he broke the logjam. So what community groups can do is really spread the word and get community buy-in, because these programs are going to be there. The city will have the money to do it. The state will have the money to do it. We need the communities to say, hey, let's go do this. We have to do this. And really, it's that communicating to the residents that you need to get this done. And by the way, it's not going to cost you anything, but get it done.
That is really good guidance. And let's make this happen. Your point's right on target. Hey, let's shift a little bit and talk about the Great Lakes, because there's been a big success. You and many others, Senator Durbin, the Great Lakes delegation, pushed hard, effectively, an extra $1 billion in funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative was in the bipartisan infrastructure package, and also funding for the Chicago Shoreline Storm Damage Reduction Project, the lakefront needing some TLC, to say the least. How is this funding going to be used? And how do you see that working out as really making a difference going forward in terms of better shoreline protection and, frankly, more accelerating the restoration and protection of the Great Lakes?
Well, as you mentioned, Congress was able to secure a substantial increase in funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. What is that going to do? Well, it's going to increase the capacity to restore areas that have been degraded. We're going to spend that money to control for invasive species. We're going to address the pollution impacts. Some of this stuff will have to be dredged away that's polluted. Our Great Lakes should be filled with fish that are safe to eat and water that is safe for recreation. I mean, bottom line, and I hope that these funds will make that happen. One of the things that's in the bipartisan infrastructure package was funds for the Army Corps of Engineers. And at the request of myself and the Illinois delegation, the Corps just recently announced they will allocate 1.5 million to the Chicago Shoreline Storm Damage Reduction Project. And I'm really excited about that because it's going to allow the Corps to complete a study to identify long-term solutions and to how we're going to mitigate the significant impacts of climate change along the Chicago shoreline. When we talk about climate change, people talk about rising sea levels, but they don't talk about rising lake levels. And
Correct.
in fact, rising sea, we're going to see rising lake levels as well. And I mean, look at the recent floodings of Lake Michigan, where there was significant erosion and storm damage. Addressing this issue is a great need for our states. I'm glad that we're going to get the Corps of Engineers to begin the study, so we have ideas on what we can do to mitigate. And of course, the Brandon Road project, which is going to stop the invasive species into getting into Lake Michigan. And I was really pleased that we got the senators from other states outside of Illinois, other than Dick and myself, to agree that we should spend that money in Illinois at Brendan Road so that we could stop these invasive species from making their way into the Great Lakes.
And, it seems obvious, but of course that's correct. If Asian carp, or carp generally, make their way into Lake Michigan, it affects Michigan, Wisconsin, and Indiana every bit as much as it affects Illinois. We're all in this one together. Mm-hmm. What we learned during the last big storm surge was, sometimes people say, well, high water levels affect this community or that community. On the south side, South Shore, apartment buildings were inundated with water. And on the north side of Chicago, Rogers Park, same thing. You wrote a letter with Senator Durbin on the need for equity in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. You wrote the letter to EPA Administrator Reagan. Can you talk a little bit about the letter and why you think it's important?
Well, I think it's important that we restore the communities that have borne the brunt of pollution that was the side effect of our nation's industrialization. So we have industrialized, at the expense of certain communities. And oftentimes what happened was the first polluting industry was located in a particular area 150 years ago. And then that just became the place where we put all of our polluting industries. Those communities basically bore the brunt and carried the weight of our nation's industrialization. And we've never gone back and fixed the issues that were there. And so it's really important that we update our policies to reflect the larger share of burdens that are faced by low-income communities, indigenous communities, and communities of color, because we keep polluting the same area more than any other place, and we never fix it. So, when I go, for example, to the south side of Chicago, and I talk to kids from this, from especially Black and Brown communities on the south side of Chicago, and I ask them, when was the last time you went to the lake and went swimming on the beach? They say never. They say never. And if you look at the records, all of the beaches in Chicago have usually get closed at least once a year per season due to pollutants in the water, right? Unsafe water, unsafe levels in the water. But on average, on the south side, it's 39 times a season.
Wow.
It is not equitable and it is wrong. And so, the saying, a rising tide raises our boats. It doesn't if your boat has holes in it. So you got to fix those boats that have holes in them, right? You can't just go in and build a park on land that is polluted. You got to go back and remediate and dredge out the polluted soil that's there. And then you can start talking about building a park there. So you have to understand that some of these communities have faced unequal burdens, higher burdens than everybody else. And in our letter, we asked for an increase in the share of grants administered by the initiative to go to communities of color, indigenous and low-income communities, and an overall prioritization of environmental justice. This isn't just an urban issue. This is a rural issue. So you have communities in the South where they have hog farms with hog waste lagoons, they call them. I mean, they're so big, just open lagoons of hog waste, right? Those communities bear an unfair burden as well. So we're going to remediate. We should go to these communities that are suffering the most, give them more resources, and then let the rising tide raise all boats. But until we fix the inequities, we're never going to be able to solve the problems in these communities that have borne the burden of industrialization for the rest of us.
Along with your wonderful metaphor of the rising tide floats all boats except those that have some holes in it, you also win the award for one of the most creative acronyms for legislation that's passed, the ASAP Act, All Stations Accessibility Program. Whoever came up with that, loved that acronym. How will the All Stations Accessibility Program, how's it going to make public transit better for people? How's it going to work? Can you talk a little bit more about the program and the improvements?
Yeah, so it's going to make it accessible. And I can't take credit for the acronym. That is from the Chicago Transit Authority, from the CTA. I had been invited by
CTA.
The CTA. I had been invited by the CTA a couple years back to go visit and highlight this ASAP initiative that the CTA had, where they were going to invest money to make every single station on the L and within the CTA system, not just the L, but bus stations as well, fully accessible. And they were very proud of it. It was the first time they were setting aside money for it. And I asked Dorval Carter, the president of the CTA, well, how long is this going to take? And he said, it's going to take 25 years, but we're going to get it done. And we're the first mass transit authority in the country that's going to do this. And we're really proud of it. And we're so glad that you're here. And at the time it was the 25th anniversary of the ADA. And I said, so a half century after the passage of the ADA is when this is going to be done? Is that good enough? And I sort of rained on his parade a little bit. And he said, and I said, well, what can we do to fix it? And what he said was, Tammy, the problem is I have a finite amount of money. And making stations accessible for people in wheelchairs or who are visually impaired, who are cognitively impaired, who have a hearing disability, that is an important priority for me. It's always in my top 3, but I never have enough money to fund my top 3. I usually only have enough money to fund my top 1, and my top 1 is always going to be safety. So the money never gets spent. It never gets to top 2 or top 3. What I need is a pot of money that is set aside just for accessibility. Can you help me with that? And so that's what I did. I brought the ASAP Act to the federal level. I put it into, and I argued for it within the bipartisan infrastructure law. And now there's $1.75 billion in funding to ensure, over 5 years, to ensure that public transportation is accessible to all commuters. That means that all of these legacy transit systems, Chicago, New York, Oakland, Boston, in particular, are going to be able to make every single station fully accessible. And that means people with disabilities, whether it's wheelchair users or the blind or the hearing impaired or cognitively impaired, are going to be able to have access to public transportation in a way that they've never had before, which means more people can get to work, more people can get to school, more people can live the productive lives that they choose to live and not be stuck at home. And that's better for all of us.
Well, congratulations to you and the work that CTA is doing. Speaking of transportation, transportation sector is now the #1 sector when it comes to greenhouse gas pollution. The bipartisan infrastructure legislation had a lot of funding for transportation. How can Illinois best use these funds to achieve both our mobility needs and our climate change goals? What should be the priorities? Can you comment on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, look, given that the transportation sector is responsible for nearly 1/3 of our US total emissions, it's critical that we address transportation. Illinois must invest these funds from the bipartisan infrastructure law in a way that prioritizes transit, electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, in addition to other low carbon transportation options, to include other forms of energy that will provide the energy to those charging stations. So we're not using petroleum to generate the electricity that then charges those vehicles, right? So we got to disconnect that. We have to ensure that the funds are used to increase access to sustainable transportation, to increase connectivity between communities and the jobs that sustain them, to get more people using public transportation because it's easy and it's cheaper and it's something that they prefer because it's better for them. They don't have to pay for parking and they don't have to drive. And the bill also includes money to restore green space in disadvantaged communities and urban areas, and significant dollars for infrastructure resiliency. So really, the state, I'm emphasizing to the state to really focus on prioritizing clean energy forms for our transit systems.
And you're completely right. I mean, if we're going to have green cars, we need to charge them with green power, not with brown power. That doesn't work very well. It's, we got to make that consistent. We need to make it work very well to use clean energy to charge clean cars.
Right.
I know your time is tight, but I wanted to make sure we got at least a couple of questions to you. You spoke at ELPC's annual gala a couple of years ago about the Environmental Justice Caucus. Since then, you've introduced the Environmental Justice for All Act. What will this legislation do? How will it make a difference in the lives of people in Illinois and across the legislation, across the nation, not the legislation? Come on, Howard.
Well, thank you. So the legislation, Environmental Justice for All Act, is basically a comprehensive piece of legislation to achieve health equity and climate justice for everyone, particularly in underserved communities and communities of color that have long been disproportionately harmed by environmental injustice and toxic pollutants. So specifically, the bill is going to do several things. Number one, it establishes grants to support communities and workers as they transition away from fossil fuel dependent economies. It amends and strengthens the Civil Rights Act to prohibit discrimination based on disparate impact. We've never thought about access to a clean environment as a civil rights, but that's what this bill does. It establishes requirements and programs concerning chemicals and toxic ingredients in products. It also creates a variety of funding programs, like a grant program to enhance access to park and recreational opportunities in an urban area. It requires community involvement during the NEPA permitting process. And most importantly, I think, it allows for cumulative impacts of pollution to be a cause for federal NEPA permit denial. So what people need to know is EPA, when they look at giving, an industry comes in and says, I want to build an automotive metal recycling plant here. And we ask for a permit for this. EPA reviews it and goes, okay, we're going to give you a permit to do this based on what it estimates the toxic or the pollution effects of that industry is going to be. But the EPA has never been required to look at the cumulative effects of all of the preceding toxic industries that were there on that same piece of land. This is what I talk about with inequities within these communities. Now they're going to be required to look at that cumulative effect of all of the other activities that were there in that community that also generated pollutants before the EPA can actually provide that permit.
This is important legislation, and many of us will be very pleased to work with you to help get it passed. Senator, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you for joining us. I'll let you know that there have been a number of questions posted. I know you don't have time to get to, but I'll just flag about the prairie over at the Rockford Airport, about microplastics in the Great Lakes, the Line 5 oil pipeline. I know you're familiar with these issues, and I just want to let you know that there's a lot of commentary on those. But thank you, Senator Duckworth, for joining us today. And really, thank you for all you're doing to better protect people, our communities, and the Great Lakes and the planet. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. If there's anything we can do, Senator, to help you advance the important legislation you're doing, and as you pointed out, for example, with the lead service pipes, to make it work well on the ground or so that it really makes a difference in people's lives, let us know. We stand by ready to do that with you at the Environmental Law and Policy Center. And for folks, keep an eye out for future ELPC Thinks invitations. But Thank you to Senator Duckworth, and we greatly appreciate all you're doing in Washington. Best
Thank you.
wishes.
Thank you.